A bar full of people, security cameras covering the entrance, a crowd slowly filtering out as last call came and went. And yet, somewhere between the music and the noise and the ordinary chaos of a Friday night, a young man simply ceased to exist. No farewell, no argument, no scene. He just stopped being there. And 20 years later, no one has been able to explain how. This is the story of Brian Shaffer, a second-year medical student, a son, a boyfriend, a man with plans, with a future, with a flight to catch in 3 days. A man who walked into a bar on the edge of spring break. And according to every camera, every witness, and every investigator who ever looked at this case, never walked out. Columbus, Ohio. April 1st, 2006. A date that sounds almost too strange to be real. Brian Randall Shaffer was born on February 11, 1979, in Pickerington, Ohio, a quiet suburb just east of Columbus. By all accounts, he was the kind of person people genuinely liked, warm, grounded, a little laid back, the way people tend to be when they're comfortable in their own skin. He went to Ohio State for his undergraduate degree and studied microbiology. Then, in 2004, he enrolled at the OSU College of Medicine. By 2006, he was 2 years in, halfway through, with the harder years still ahead of him, but moving forward. He had a girlfriend named Alexis Wagoner, also a second-year medical student. People who knew them described them as serious, committed. And those closest to Brian believed he was planning to propose to her during their upcoming spring break trip to Miami. That trip was scheduled for April 3rd. He never made it. The weeks before his disappearance had been hard. His mother, Beverly Shaffer, had been sick for some time with myelodysplasia, a rare and serious form of cancer that affects bone marrow. She passed away in mid-March 2006, just 3 weeks before Brian vanished. Grief like that doesn't disappear overnight, but the people around Brian, his friends, his father, those who saw him regularly, said he wasn't falling apart. He was sad, yes, he was grieving, but he was still himself, still talking about the future, still looking forward to Miami, to Alexis, to finishing school. There was nothing, as far as anyone could tell, that suggested what was about to happen. On the evening of March 31st, Brian had dinner with his father, Randy Shaffer. A quiet meal. Just the two of them, still finding their footing after losing Beverly. Afterward, Brian met up with friends, his roommate, William Florence, who went by Clint, and a woman named Meredith Reed. The plan was simple: bar hopping near campus, the kind of night that happens 1,000 times every weekend in a college town. Nothing unusual, nothing noteworthy. The group made their way along North High Street, the long commercial strip that runs through the heart of the Ohio State campus area, stopping at several bars over the course of the evening. At some point, they ended up at the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a well-known student bar located at 1546 North High Street. Second floor. You reached it by escalator. Surveillance footage captured Brian entering at around 1:15 in the morning. That was April 1st now, just after midnight. What happened inside the bar during those next 40 minutes is, in many ways, the central mystery of this entire case. Because what happened outside of it is where the story starts to unravel. At around 1:55 in the morning, security cameras captured Brian Shaffer standing just outside the bar's second-floor entrance. He was talking with 2 women he had apparently met that night. later identified as Brighton Zatko and Amber Ruich. The conversation looked casual, relaxed. Nothing about his body language suggested distress or urgency. They talked for a few minutes, the way you do at the end of a night out when you're not quite ready to call it yet. Then, Brian turned and walked back toward the bar's entrance. That was the last confirmed image of Brian Shaffer ever recorded. He walked back toward the door, and that was it. When the Ugly Tuna closed at 2 a.m., Clint Florence was waiting outside with Meredith Reed. They expected Brian to come down the escalator with the rest of the crowd filtering out at the end of the night. He didn't. At the time, Florence wasn't alarmed. He assumed Brian had slipped out ahead of him, maybe found another way home, maybe caught a cab. It happened. It wasn't worth worrying about yet. But the next morning, Brian wasn't at his apartment. His phone went straight to voicemail. And by April 3rd, the day he was supposed to be on a plane to Miami with Alexis, it became impossible to ignore. Brian Shaffer was gone. The Columbus Police Department responded quickly. In the first few days of the investigation, up to 50 officers were involved in the search at any one time. More than 100 interviews were conducted. The building was searched. The surrounding area was searched. The Olentangy River, which runs near that part of campus, was examined. Nothing. No trace of Brian anywhere. His credit cards showed no activity. His bank accounts were untouched. His apartment held nothing out of the ordinary. His phone continued to go to voicemail, sitting silent, suggesting the battery had either died or the phone had been turned off. And then investigators turned to the surveillance footage, and that's when the case took on a quality that has haunted it ever since. The Ugly Tuna Saloona had cameras covering its entrance. Investigators reviewed that footage frame by frame, hour by hour, accounting for every person who came in and everyone who went out. One of the original investigators on the case, retired Columbus Police Sergeant John Hurst, would later state, with complete certainty, that Brian Shaffer did not leave through the main escalator entrance. He simply was not on that footage going out. Every other patron who entered that night was accounted for leaving, except Brian. So the question became, how do you walk into a building and not walk out of it? The bar had limited exits. The main entrance via escalator was covered by cameras. There was, however, a service exit, a door that led to an area under construction at the time, with access points to the street. That area was reportedly heavily under construction, disorienting even for someone sober. Navigating it in the early hours of the morning, having spent a night out drinking, would not have been easy. And there was one additional detail that has kept investigators uncomfortable for 2 decades. At least one of the cameras near the entrance was not stationary. It rotated. And that rotation created small windows, brief gaps in coverage, where it was theoretically possible for someone to pass through without being captured on film. Small windows, but windows nonetheless. Whether Brian used the service exit, slipped through a gap in camera coverage, or whether something else entirely happened inside that building, no one has ever been able to say for certain. In the months that followed, Brian's girlfriend Alexis continued to call his phone every single evening before she went to sleep. Every night, the phone going directly to voicemail, the way it had since that first morning. Then, One night in September 2006, roughly 5 months after he disappeared, something changed. The phone rang 3 times, and then voicemail. Alexis reported this immediately. Investigators looked into it. Brian's wireless provider suggested it might have been a computer glitch, a technical anomaly, nothing more. But there was something else. A ping. A signal from Brian's phone that had registered at a cell tower in Hilliard, Ohio, 14 miles northwest of Columbus. Brian's phone was not GPS-enabled, so pinpointing an exact location was impossible. But a signal had been detected. Somewhere in that direction, at some point, his phone had connected to a tower. Was it a glitch? A delayed signal bouncing through the network? Or something more? It was never definitively resolved. Investigators ran lie detector tests on several key people connected to the case. Brian's father, Randy Shaffer, passed. Meredith Reed passed. Clint Florence, Brian's roommate, the man who was with him that night, and the last of his close friends to see him, refused to take one. No public explanation was ever given for that refusal. Florence was never charged with any crime. Investigators have never publicly named him as a suspect. But the refusal has stayed in the minds of those who follow this case ever since. And there was another gap. One that wasn't discovered until 2009. Brighton Zatko and Amber Ruich, the two women captured on camera speaking with Brian just before he vanished, the last people confirmed to have interacted with him, were never asked to take a lie detector test. They were identified in 2009, 3 years after the fact. When asked about it, they reportedly said no one had ever approached them about taking one. How that gap occurred in the investigation has never been fully explained. Randy Shaffer, Brian's father, never stopped looking for his son. In the years that followed, he walked the banks of the Olentangy River himself, sometimes alone, sometimes with help, searching for any sign. A psychic had suggested that Brian's body might be near a bridge pier somewhere along the river. Randy followed that lead the way, a grieving father follows any lead that might bring him closer to an answer. He found nothing. Randy Shaffer passed away in 2014, never knowing what happened to his son. Brian's younger brother Derek is now the only surviving member of Brian's immediate family. He has continued to advocate for answers. In 2021, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation released an age-progressed photograph showing what Brian Shaffer might look like at age 42. The kind of image that carries its own particular weight. A reminder that somewhere, if he's alive, he's a middle-aged man, and if he's not, someone knows something. Over the years, a number of theories have taken shape around this case. Some feel possible, some feel desperate, and some carry a weight that's hard to dismiss. The first theory is voluntary disappearance. That Brian, overwhelmed by grief, by the pressure of medical school, by the enormity of what lay ahead of him, chose to simply walk away from his life. It sounds plausible on the surface. People do disappear. Not often, but it happens. And the circumstances, the recent loss of his mother, the intense demands of medical training, the seriousness of a relationship heading toward engagement, created a kind of pressure that could, in theory, become unbearable. But those who knew him pushed back on this. Hard. Brian had plans. Real, concrete plans. A vacation booked. A relationship he was apparently thriving in. A career path he had worked years to reach. and there was no history, none, of erratic behavior, mental health crises, or any indication that he was thinking about disappearing. People who wanted to vanish tended to leave traces, searches, withdrawals, goodbyes they thought no one would notice. Brian left nothing. The second theory is accidental death, that Brian, possibly intoxicated, made his way out through the service exit, became disoriented or lost in the construction, and met with some kind of accident, that he ended up in the river or somewhere else entirely, and was simply never found. It's a scenario investigators have not ruled out. Columbus has its waterways. Bodies have been missed before. The Olentangy runs near enough to that area that, under the right circumstances, it's not impossible. But there's nothing to confirm it either. No physical evidence, no clothing, no belongings, no witnesses who saw a disoriented young man stumbling through a construction site in the early hours of the morning. Just absence. The third theory, and the one that retired Sergeant John Hurst has said he believes most likely, is foul play. Hurst has been direct about this. In interviews over the years, he has stated clearly that his current belief is that Brian Shaffer is probably deceased, and that foul play was most likely involved. That's a significant statement from one of the original investigators. And there's something else that lends it weight. A missing persons advocate who runs a social media page dedicated to Brian's case received a tip at some point. A tip naming a specific individual. When she brought that name to Columbus police, the detective's reaction was notable. He was reportedly surprised she knew the name, because that person had been on the department's radar since 2006, since the very beginning. When the case was assigned a new detective in 2020, that same name surfaced again. And there are reports, though unconfirmed in official records, that police searched the basement of a house near Lane Avenue in connection with this individual. Who that person is has never been made public. Their connection to Brian, the nature of police interest in them, the outcome of any searches, none of it has been officially confirmed or released. But the suggestion is there, quiet and persistent, that someone out there knows more than they have said. That someone, possibly, has known since the night it happened. Investigators briefly looked at whether Brian's disappearance might be connected to something called the smiley face murder theory, a controversial idea suggesting that the drowning deaths of young men across various American cities are linked to an organized killer or group, with smiley face graffiti found near some of the locations as a possible signature. Columbus investigators ultimately rejected any connection to that theory in Brian's case. They found no compelling evidence to link his disappearance to the wider pattern. It was one door closing. Many others remain open. There is something about this case that gets under your skin if you sit with it long enough. It isn't just that a man disappeared. People go missing. Tragically, it happens all the time. But most disappearances eventually have an explanation. A body is found. A person resurfaces. A witness comes forward. The camera footage shows something that everyone missed the first time. In Brian Shaffer's case, none of that happened. He walked into a building. Multiple cameras were running. The venue was full of people. It was 2006, not 1976. Surveillance technology existed. Witnesses existed. The infrastructure for finding a missing person existed. And still, nothing. A bar full of people, and no one saw him leave. A system full of cameras, and none of them captured it. A phone that went silent for 5 months, and then rang 3 times in the dark. 20 years of tips. 20 years of searches. 20 years of a family waiting for something, anything, that would give them an answer. Randy Shaffer walked those riverbanks for years. He never found his son. He died without knowing. Derek Shaffer carries that absence still. Alexis Wagoner called that phone every night before bed for months. Every night the voicemail, and then one September evening, 3 rings. Think about what that must have felt like. 3 rings, and then silence again. The question that sits at the center of this case, the one that no theory has ever fully answered, is the exit. How did Brian Shaffer leave that building? If he left through the service exit and something happened to him in the construction area or along the river, why was nothing ever found? If he chose to disappear, where did he go? And how has he stayed hidden for 20 years without a single confirmed sighting? If someone hurt him, how? In a bar full of people? Through a construction site no one noticed? And where's Brian now? Every theory requires you to accept something uncomfortable. Every explanation has a gap, and every gap leads back to the same place. A man who walked toward a door at 1:55 in the morning and simply wasn't there anymore. As of April 2026, 20 years to the month since Brian Shaffer disappeared, the case remains officially unsolved. There are still detectives assigned to it. Tips still come in. That name, the one that has reportedly been known to police since 2006, has not gone away. Somewhere out there, someone has information. It might be the person of interest investigators have circled for 2 decades. It might be a bartender who noticed something that night and never thought to report it. It might be someone who saw a figure moving through a construction site in the early hours of April 1st, 2006, and dismissed it as nothing. Whatever it is, it's still out there. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old. He was studying to become a doctor. He loved Pearl Jam. He had a girlfriend he was probably going to ask to marry him. He had a father who loved him enough to spend years walking a riverbank on the slim chance of finding something. He deserves an answer. His family deserves an answer. If you have any information about the disappearance of Brian Shaffer, you can contact the Columbus Division of Police at 614-645-4545. You can also reach Central Ohio Crime Stoppers anonymously at 614-461-8477. You don't have to give your name. You just have to make the call. 20 years. A man walked in and didn't walk out. Somewhere, the answer exists. It always does.